I'm most intrigued by the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. I wish it was still there. Of all the seven wonders, that is the one I wish had not been destroyed. It's so unusual. It excites one's imagination.
Fragments of the ancient city survive, but the Hanging Gardens have been lost forever. Some scholars doubt whether they could have existed here. How was it possible to have built terraced gardens in an area without building stone?
Babylon's built on a huge, great, flat alluvial plain, and there's no stone nearby, so they have to use mud. And they would dig the mud from the riverbank, creating a sort of moat around the city. And then the mud would be formed into bricks. And then as it bakes in the sun, you would end up with really quite a sturdy product. You can't just take the bare mud and pack it into a brick. So he's processing the mud by stamping it and adding water to it to give it just the right consistency, so that when it is slopped into the mould, he has a brick which you can recognisably see as a brick and not just a heap of mud. Mud, when it's baked and compacted, is a very strong and capable building material. And there are many examples in ancient history of walls that are built to really quite a significant height using baked earth and mud. Sometimes that needs to be reinforced, perhaps with straw or reeds, which would be laid flat and then more earth compacted on top. But as long as you created a big, wide, massive wall, essentially, it would be a very strong and capable material.
Babylon was situated on the Euphrates in present-day Iraq. In the 6th century BC, King Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it. The walls were so splendid that the Greek poet Antipater had included them as one of the 7 wonders. Herodotus was also impressed by them.
They formed a square. Along the top were walkways wide enough for 2 chariots to pass. There were 100 bronze gates in the circuit of the walls. It was some 56 miles around the whole city.
Behind the Ishtar Gateway, inside the city walls, the streets were laid out on a grid plan. Babylon was the most splendid city in the world. A blend of sophistication and order. King Nebuchadnezzar ruled Babylonia from his palace. He married Princess Amytis from the land of Media. Their marriage symbolized a prosperous union between their countries. Babylonia now looked forward to a period of peace and plenty. Above the palace, Nebuchadnezzar built the grandest celebration of this new era, the Hanging Gardens. They were a spectacular surprise for his queen. The earliest account of them comes from Berossus, a priest writing 200 years after they were built.
And within this palace, Nebuchadnezzar erected the so-called Hanging Garden, because his wife, having been brought up in the country of Media, had a passion for mountain surroundings.
The gardens are often controlled by the monarch of a particular culture. That monarch is showing that he or she can control the landscape and can make it flower in a way that God cannot in the landscape around them. Controlling water, of course, controlling life in a very desert landscape or in an arid landscape is a great feat.
In the Middle East, gardening was a respected profession. Plants were grown for medicine and also for the perfume industry. The importance of fragrance may explain why accounts record that some gardeners were blind and some female.
Records show that Nebuchadnezzar's gardener was given special rations from the palace. He is believed to have been an expert from Judea, a country with a similarly arid climate. The Babylonians had a great knowledge of plants.
The gardeners in Babylon would have selected the best plants to thrive in the hot, arid climate.
The Middle East is not all a desert, but it's generally arid, and it was felt important to bring exotic types of plants, different types of plants, and a richness of vegetation in a controlled situation so people could enjoy it, particularly the king.
There are a number of ways plants have adapted to survive in harsh environments like the Middle East. One way is to have thin, needle-like leaves. Grasses and conifers are good examples of this. Their very small surface area ensures little water loss. Others have leathery or waxy leaves to prevent water loss. Often they are grey in color, which reflects the glare of the sun. Some plants have leaves covered in fine hairs. These reduce the drying effect of the wind and also trap the cold night air to keep the plant cool during the day. Oak, willow and cedar, ilex, plane and palm. The lists of the trees and the plants in the hanging gardens are endless. They were compiled by historians centuries later and are often inaccurate. It is believed the gardens contained many plants and trees from the land of Medea, the homeland of Nebuchadnezzar's queen. As well as adding color, the flowers of orange and lemon trees would have produced a fragrant scent. However the gardens were planted out, they needed water. Ancient writers recorded that there were hidden machines used for irrigation. Scholars have investigated buckets on ropes, water wheels, and even the Archimedes water screw. This device is attributed to the great Greek mathematician and inventor. It is believed Archimedes created it while in Egypt, having watched villagers pump water from the Nile. But the Hanging Gardens were built 2 centuries before him.
The only device we have evidence for at that period is in fact the shaduf, a very simple tip beam device that's known as early as the 3rd millennium BC. You have a counterweight at one end and a basket on the end of a rope or a pole at the other that lifts the water up. We have illustrations of it from the 2nd millennium BC onward. We have illustrations of it in Assyrian art from the time the Hanging Gardens supposedly were functioning, and there are no illustrations of other devices that would have been suitable. So it seems to me that this is the only solution.
Today we overcome our engineering problems with machinery. The ancients often looked no further than human labor, and in Babylon there was an endless supply. The Western perception of the Hanging Gardens has been highly idealized. Terraced gardens with abundant water, even waterfalls.
When I was a child, the image conjured up by the Hanging Gardens was that of gardens that somehow hung downwards. But in fact, if you look at gardens that are carefully maintained in the Middle East on terraces, generally you have plants that rise upward from the terraces.
In arid regions, in the desert, water is so precious it's like gold. They have to control how they use it very, very carefully. They let the water come in down channels, and then they release the water so that it just rushes out, just for perhaps 10 minutes a day, and then they'll shut it off again and conserve it for the next day. Just a tiny amount of water has created an intensity of color, green trees, which is just totally unexpected.
Water could have been taken from the Euphrates, carried or lifted up to a cistern on the top terrace. From there it would have trickled down through the different levels of the garden. The irrigation of the Hanging Gardens is only part of the riddle, taunting archaeologists. The more baffling puzzle has been to find their exact location. The city of Babylon was known across the ancient world, but accounts of the Hanging Gardens were hard to find, even at the time of their construction.
Well, the Hanging Gardens are a kind of historical mirage. We have sources from the 1st century AD that say there was Hanging Gardens at Babylon, but Herodotus, who's writing very close to the time the gardens supposedly were built, doesn't mention the gardens at all. If they were so spectacular, you'd expect him to say something.
It is likely they were destroyed within a century of their construction. After Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon became a pawn in the struggle between the Persians and the Macedonians, and was severely damaged.
We know that Babylon was very badly destroyed by the Persian king Xerxes in the 480s BC, and the fragile mechanisms and the fragility indeed of the plants themselves, one can't imagine that they survived that kind of ordeal.
Some archaeologists have looked elsewhere to find another location for them.
The most convincing explanation, which says that there is a confusion in the beginnings of this legend, and that really what the Hanging Gardens refer to are the palace gardens built by an Assyrian king in Nineveh, which was the great capital of the Assyrian kingdom, something like 100 or 150 years before Nebuchadnezzar.
Despite their short lifespan, the gardens have gained legendary status. They remain unique among the 7 wonders as the only one displaying nature's beauty, and they live on as the most famous gardens ever. The balance of power in the Middle East would change, and with it the fortunes of Babylon. Persian armies under Cyrus the Great overran the Babylonian Empire.
Just 200 years later, an awesome army recruited amongst the valleys and mountains of the Greek mainland would conquer Babylon once again. Under Alexander the Great, they stormed across the plains, east as far as the Indus and south as far as Egypt. Greek artists, sculptors and masons followed in the wake of Alexander's armies. They spread the influence of Greek architecture and culture to new lands, as well as harnessing local techniques for use back in Greece. Under Alexander, for the first time, all the wonders of the ancient world were brought within the same empire.
The idea of 7 wonders is in many ways inconceivable without Alexander the Great. His conquests in Babylonia and Egypt brought the Hanging Gardens and the pyramids to greater Greek prominence.
Babylon in particular caught Alexander's imagination.
Alexander was interested in Babylon as the center of learning, the center of power, the traditional center for Mesopotamia, and indeed he died in Babylon and was planning his last campaigns there, and was, I think, planning to make Babylon the capital of his syncretistic empire. So he certainly saw Babylon as a key place in the geography of the world.